very hard, and I was doing it on telly, which made it even worse. But the one thing that really got them going was Roman numerals. So I said, and I sat down, and after having really hard work with these little toughs who were playing up to the cameras, they so liked learning Roman numbers. So I said to them at the end of the lesson, why on earth did you get off on that? You've been horrible, but now you sit and look at and really take Roman numerals seriously. And they said, do you know, at the end of most television programmes on the BBC, they write the date in Roman numbers, and we've never known what it was. And I thought, that is a little version of empowerment. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't rest my case wholly on that, but it was eye-opening.
Vidya, Mary mentioned earlier rotten translations, and a question about the importance of reading the classics in the original. I have a colleague who regularly says that the difference between reading a Sanskrit text in the original and reading a translation of a Sanskrit text is a bit like the difference between actually meeting a person and talking to them and just hearing about that person from somebody else. Do you agree with that?
If I had the facility of reading Sanskrit or Tamil, ancient Tamil, as I read English, I guess I would say that certainly is so. But unfortunately, there are very few people who can do that. I greatly admire them. So I do always start with something that somebody has translated, sometimes in the 19th century, sometimes even earlier. And then when I come to something that I think is really important, and I must check, I do have to have a pile of dictionaries, and then I do sit down with the original, or I go to somebody, preferably, who is completely familiar with that. And yes, it does make a difference, particularly if translations have been made a long time ago and have used, if they're in English, they are Victorian English, so they are very worried to use actual words for parts of the body that they think should not be mentioned in polite conversation. Yeah. And particularly when it's sensuous poetry, they gloss over it a lot. So it is important many times, very often, to go back to the original. But to have that facility to read it just that way is not something I have. And I think very few people do.
No, anybody who makes some macho claim about, of course, I always read it only in the original, is always lying. Just always lying.
But I think, Alex, one of the things is that one of the drawbacks that we face in India increasingly is the lack of publishing in the field that's come up now, because there are so few, both scholars and publishers who are representing the classics. And the business of taking out critical editions of classics of classical literature has really finished. It barely happens. We are reliant on critical editions from decades ago. And it's a serious matter because there have been massive discoveries in the past 50, 60 years of many more manuscripts or versions of that same text. And no scholar has actually been sitting and comparing the classical texts that they found, or palm leaf manuscripts or birch bark manuscripts, and the various versions to see what are the minor differences in the way it has been recorded and how many versions there may be in existence in different museums and repositories of a particular ancient manuscript, and actually seeing if there's a historical development, or was it a completely fixed text or a changing text, and what's the nature of the change in that text, are things that we really aren't doing enough of at all. And I think it's far more dynamic in the field of Greek and Latin than it is in the world of Sanskrit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little known fact quite how many surviving Sanskrit manuscripts there are.
Right.
An estimate was recently put, and most of you will not believe this figure, 30 million surviving Sanskrit manuscripts.
I don't believe that.
Well, this was not some. I mean, to people outside the field, this does seem absolutely extraordinary. But to Sanskritists, that figure was actually come up with by one of the most respected Sanskrits of the previous generation, who was working with Sanskrit manuscripts as much as any other scholar.
Well, I'll tell you what you needed. This is a slightly relevant anecdote. When I was working on the history of how Latin and Greek had been taught at Cambridge, I discovered that in the 1870s there was a major proposal that was nearly successful that we should teach Greek, Latin and Sanskrit together. And we should make the classical course at Cambridge 3 languages, not 2. And I remember...
We need that.
I feel conflicted about this. I thought, blimey, it's bad enough learning Latin and Greek. You have to read Sanskrit as well. You'd never get through it. But in a sense, that institutional framework would... I can see now why that would be important.
I mean, it's a very old-fashioned thing to have, and it used to be. I mean, you remember there used to be people who used to be trained for their civil service exams, and they had to learn Latin and Greek, and they'd had some prior education in Sanskrit, and they'd go along to be able to, and they spent their lives as administrators being able to handle all kinds of different texts.
I have to say, I must confess that one of the arguments used for doing Sanskrit with Latin and Greek was that it would be very useful in the Indian civil service.
Yes.
It was not a winning argument.
Well, it's not a winning argument today, but on the other hand, we live in a world which is increasingly global, where transculturalism has become a buzzword. Multiculturalism is a standard, and if we have to cohabit and be cognizant of plural histories and be aware of each other's baggages and backgrounds and cultural identity forming texts, how can we not be talking to each other again, as I'm sure the ancients were?
And I think also that sense of, we often pay lip service to multiculturalism without it meaning very much. But I think in my lifetime studying Latin and Greek, the way we've thought about Latin and Greek classics in the world has fundamentally changed in relation to seeing their links to other literary traditions. And I remember when I first went to Pompeii when I was a kid, there's a very pretty little ivory Indian statuette was found in Pompeii in the so-called House of the Indian Statuette. I remember being shown it as if it was some kind of freak. Isn't this weird? Here we've got Pompeii and here's this Indian statuette. My God. Now, one of the most interesting archaeological developments that there is in my particular field of Roman imperial history is precisely when you can get into the eastern Egyptian desert, looking at the loads and loads and loads of clear evidence for major trade links between India and the Roman Empire. Yeah. They're all over the place. And I think back to how I was taught to talk about this little Indian statuette from Pompeii as if no one could imagine how on earth it got there. 20, 30 years later, that sense of there are these kind of cultural contexts within the Roman Empire itself is now absolutely mainstream.
We had a Roman numismatist who spent a whole year with us at Columbia, and he gave a number of papers on how he thought the Roman gold coinage had been entirely created for the India trade, that before that there wasn't the need to have gold, that silver coinage was enough, but the trade with India was so vast that they couldn't sort of just ship that much silver coins, and so Roman coins were actually created at that time.
Absolutely vast.
And this, as you say, the whole trade connection is enormous.
And we were just blind to it. It was there, but we didn't see. And it's not it has changed. It's not that there are some new discoveries, but it isn't particularly that there have been new discoveries. It's just we're looking for things in a different way.
Way now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've changed, not it.
Yeah, and I mean, you've worked on that a little bit, Naman. The way there was much more transculturalism between the ancient world of India and Europe. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Well, one of my main areas of interest and what excites me a lot is to try and find correspondences in the visual iconography of how images influenced each other. Civilizations were influenced by each other's images. And I think one of the most interesting direct imports that came into the Indian subcontinent at this time were two images, one of Harpocrates, is one of the children of Isis, and became endemic during the Roman period. And you get a large number of images of Harpocrates all the way in Gandhara and in Mathura, not far from here. Or you get images of Serapis, again in the Indian subcontinent. They've been found, a few have been found in Pakistan. You get, apart from major deities that have moved, you get an enormous amount of visual iconography of actual styles of Roman and Greek art, which spread all the way from Andhra Pradesh upward through the entire subcontinent. And that kind of exchange happens you're not just looking at something, you're also exchanging ideas. You're exchanging ideas at a much more profound level, really, because your sense of drama, your sense of the theatre, the kind of spaces and contexts in which these things are placed, it's bound to be there in the drama and the literature as well, and it must be implicit in so much that we haven't actually excavated the texts for it, even though archaeologists and art historians are more used to doing that kind of visual correspondence and equation.
I wanted to put a question to you, Mary, about the cost of university education is increasing quite rapidly in England. Would you recommend to an 18-year-old child of yours or an 18-year-old relation of yours to shell out the money for a degree in classics?
Well, I can answer that utterly honestly, because one of mine did do a degree in classics, only one. After he'd finished, he went other ways, but so I did put my money where my mouth was.
That wasn't as a result of you pushing him in that direction?
No, I was actually trying to dissuade him, but adolescents are very counter-suggestible. So the more I said there were all sorts of other subjects to do, the more he said he wanted to do classics. And what I really should have done is said, oh, let's read some Plato tonight. And that would have put him off. But I mean, I think the answer to that is kind of obviously yes. And do we think that a university education is entirely vocational? No, we don't. Do we think that there is still something in the old-fashioned, I wouldn't say training the mind line, because that does sound terribly Victorian. Classics is very good for you because it trained your mind, and it made you feel a bit like a sort of athlete that was kind of, that somehow grammar really sort of got its muscles working. But it's what classics is extremely good at is introducing you to a way of talking about and to your own culture. It's also a very good subject for doing what university education really does, which is teach you, a degree course teaches you how to learn. And that's the bottom line. And frankly, I think as long as it does that, you can be learning Sanskrit, Latin, folk tale, French, psychology, you name it, art history, anything. The point about a university education is it enables you to spend the rest of your life knowing how to learn something. And when anxious parents, as they do, you do get your question, and anxious parents says, little Susie's rather keen on classics, but we're wondering if it's going to lead anywhere for a career, and times are tough and there's a recession. And the good thing that you can say is that classics has a better employment record 6 months after graduation in Cambridge than any other arts subject, and then a good number of science subjects. If you do pure maths, you don't get a job in it. It might be a good thing to do, you might also learn how to learn, but it doesn't get you a job.
Surprising.
You know, when people say science is useful, I mean, I think some of it really is. But if they looked at what pure mathematicians do, you know, they looked how they spend their days. You know, look, it's not useful. It might be brilliant, and I don't want to stop it. Don't anyone say she said pure maths should be abolished. I'm very keen on preserving it, but I just hate the idea that people say it's useful.
Vidya, do your students have to study classical literature?
Well, we have to study the literature. Now let's talk about. I'm talking now about PhD students. At that level, obviously, you have to study Sanskrit to a certain degree, and the language of the area of your research or the period of your research. So language is absolutely vital for two reasons. One, they're going to have to go and do their field work in that region, so they better be able to speak the local language just to get by and to eat and travel. And secondly, they need a degree of the language so that they can look at whatever archival material there is. It may be, in my case, a lot of it is inscriptional material. It could be Sthala Puranas of temples, and it could be literary texts. So at a PhD level, it's absolutely vital. At the undergraduate level, we do not demand the language.
I ask you this because I'm sort of, as Alex said, I teach at JNU, and in India we're increasingly confronted with the issue that how much Sanskrit and how much classical literature do our students need to know or be aware of in order to be able to study medieval or ancient art or history. And it's a losing battle. The education in classical languages is declining very rapidly, and in fact, I mean, we have got a serious crisis. You're talking about reading epigraphs. There's nobody in India around, I mean, hardly anyone who engages with ancient Kharoshti. And there's, I mean, forget Kharoshti, but that was hard enough ages ago. But even Brahmi, there are few people who can really read epigraphic records correctly. And this is a serious problem that we have in India, where there aren't enough people to even engage with the script, forget about knowing what it means.
And I think there's a very odd double standard here, because if you were to get someone saying, look, what I intend to do is I want to work on French literature and French art and culture, but I'm going to do it in translation, you'd think, that's barking mad, isn't it? You don't do French culture in translation at degree level, though we're quite happy to have another set of subjects where we say, oh, it's all right, you can do that without knowing the language.
Yeah.
And there is no more or less reason to know ancient languages than modern languages.
Well, for Sanskrit literature, most of it is untranslated, so there's not even that option, yeah.
Quite a lot of Latin and Greek literature is untranslated.
Really?
Some of it deservedly so, I think. Deservedly untranslated. But how do you know until you've looked at it?
There's masses of inscriptions which are like that.
Yeah.
Even if a dynasty as major as the Cholas, the estimate is that there are 9,000 inscriptions, of which 3,500 have actually been published, printed, out of which 2,000 have not been translated in their entirety, but have the gist of it translated into English. So there's vast amount of material still waiting to
Vast
be.
amount of material. And these 30 million or however many million Sanskrit manuscripts that are many of them just rotting away and becoming destroyed through neglect. Most of those manuscripts have not even been catalogued yet. Not only have they not been read, we don't even know
what they're about.
We don't know what the title of the text is. There could be. It's quite likely that there are some completely undiscovered masterpieces there, rotting away as yet unread.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think, for us, trying to interpret sculptures and paintings, architecture, to try and get an estimation of what history was like and what society might have been like, using them as culturally informative texts, especially with regard to medieval science and ancient science. Again, we know so little, because a large number of these manuscripts are actually scientific in nature. They're about some issue and some sort of particular subject. It could be medical very often, or mathematics and astrological. But nobody is actually reading that stuff. And without it, when you look at the placement of sculpture or trying to understand iconometric systems, it becomes difficult. These things are useful to be able to understand a society's approach to a particular matter, even if you don't know precisely what it's leading up to. You've used a lot of texts in your work.
Yes, in both Sanskrit and earlier on a lot of Sanskrit, and more recently in Tamil. But I have to tell you that going back to what is called Middle Tamil of the 6th to the 9th centuries was, just because I can speak modern Tamil, it was 3 years of solid work going back to that period. And my Tamil master was getting so mad with me, saying, "Can't you see, this is the word, this is how we say it today, this is what it was then." And I said, "No, I can't." And suddenly, year 4, it just finally sank in. But it's a difficult, it's not easy, it's not what you would spend your time doing on an evening.
A bit of relaxation.
Drinking from that
medieval
rock spring of whatever. I think maybe a single malt would be a better idea.
It's hard work. The thing is, it's hard work, but the rewards are immense. And I don't know what it's like here in terms of high school, primary and high school education. But the tendency in the UK a bit is to go for the education of instant gratification. That therefore musical scales. You really can't expect them to learn those. Learn your verb paradigms in Latin and Greek. Well, that's very boring. At this point, I feel about 95 and say, look, some of education is boring at the point when you do it, but actually later, it really opens up, more to you than you ever imagined. Even Jacqueline Dupre, I am sure, complained about practicing her cello.
Right.
When she was little.
You're talking about the potential rewards being immense, and I wanted to ask you, could you tell us what's the most exciting recent discovery in your field?
I think it's quite hard to know what to mean by exciting. The one in my field that has most of all sparked a popular excitement, shared, I think, by the professionals, is all the documents that have come up from Hadrian's Wall, letters of the soldiers and the soldiers' wives, the invitations to birthday parties, the rosters which, complain that someone's lost his socks, and this kind of stuff. And it's as a kind of way in to a military community, a military occupying community in North Britain. It sparked everybody's interest in a quite extraordinary way. It has both got people very excited, people living near Hadrian's Wall very excited by it, but it is actually also part of changing our views of how the Roman army operated, honestly. The British have always studied the Roman army as if it was the British army, and so that's the model, that's what an army is. So they were very, very puzzled to find not only these letters from women, but loads and loads of things that could only be female shoes. You know, why so many female shoes on an army base? Well, you take one question is there being, you know, there's unlucky prostitutes leaving their shoes behind when they come in. Much more likely, as we now see, Roman army bases are family units. They've got, you know, people have shacked up with somebody else. There's kids around. You know, they aren't sort of the Colonel Blimp kind of style British version of the army at all. And that's a very little thing, but you start then to think about the armies of occupation across the Roman Empire, and they start to seem a bit different. And they're also such fun.
So that's exciting discoveries. How about unsolved mysteries, Vidya? Any sort of tantalizing unsolved mysteries in your field?
Within the field of Indian material, there are so many. And because I'm dealing with inscriptions right now, I'll just mention one, and then you can ask all the others. A lot of early Buddhist sculptures have got label inscriptions on them. Not just donative inscriptions, those are different, but they actually have labels identifying the theme. And one of the questions that I find extremely puzzling is, one, what was the level of actual literacy? Who was actually reading these inscriptions? I'm talking about the 1st century BC. Who was reading them? And why put them on the sculpture when for those who know what it is, it's obvious. This is the enlightenment of the Buddha. This is the birth of the Buddha. Why do you need to write them there? So what purpose did they serve? And I just haven't come up with an answer to that. I mean, it's very easy to say that, well, it was there as an instruction for the sculptor, but then wouldn't you put it in a part of the sculpture where it would be defaced by the sculpture itself, or... There's just one. If we start on that, I think we can all go on forever.
I mean,
so maybe
30 million texts waiting to be read. There are there's scripts which haven't yet been deciphered. There's that Shankhalipi, which is across monuments all over that nobody quite understands, with their very fabulously calligraphic strokes, which look like serpents and conch shells arranged in. Beautifully across monuments, and you don't across more rock faces, and nobody's quite figured out what they say. And I mean, there's all kinds of.
But some of the mysteries are things that we forget are mysteries, I think, because I mean, one of the things that is most puzzling about the ancient Greco-Roman world would be to say, look, and I think it's my mysteries. If I was going back to the Greco-Roman world to find out something, it's what I'd go to do. It's what actually happened in a Roman house? You know, we've excavated thousands and thousands of Roman houses, and frankly, we still don't know what the rooms were used for. You know, you can see the lavatory and you can see the kitchen, but after that, what did anybody do in it? And the same with Roman baths. You can pick up kind of kids' everyday life in the Roman world books, and it'll tell you exactly what happened in the Roman baths. They went in, they took their clothes off here, they went into the cold room, they then had a dip, they went into the warm room, and it really is a bit like a Turkish bath. You know, all of that is fantasy, actually. We don't have the foggiest clue how people used a Roman bath. And I think that's another case where some of the mysteries are what we choose to open our eyes to. And I'd just like to know, I think if I could go back to the ancient world, which I really wouldn't want to, if I could go back to the Roman world, I'd want to have a day at the baths. Very dirty it was too, I think.
I think in a minute we'll take questions from the audience. Just one last question I wanted to ask. You mentioned earlier, Mary, about, you know, there's a lot of labour involved in this kind of work. You have to understand a single sentence. You'll often need a commentary and a dictionary, and a lot of the work of a scholar of classics is very painstaking, laborious, and the results are often only really of interest to people within the field. But you've managed to combine doing both cutting-edge research and making your subject interesting to non-specialists. How have you managed to do that?
I think I've been A, very lucky, but B, I think the key is to say that if you think that the history of, let's say, the Roman Empire is interesting at a professional, specialist, technical level, then it's also, if it interests you as a specialist, it will interest people out there. It really will, as long as you don't treat them as idiots who need to be talked down to, and you don't use a load of ridiculous jargon. And when I've done teleprograms, people have come to me and they said, oh, it must be so different doing a teleprogram from teaching undergraduates at Cambridge. They're so, you know. I said, actually, it's exactly the same. If I'm any good at doing telly, it's because I spent 30 years teaching Cambridge undergraduates. And all you have to do is make sure that you recognise that you're talking to people who may not know as much as you do, but are as smart as you are. And then everything follows, it seems to me. The worst crime of popularisation is talking down to people.
Okay, well, that's a great note to end on. And if we've got some mics, I'd now like to open it up for discussion. I can't really see people very well because of these lights.
There's lots of hands.
If you hold your hand up, I'll start with this gentleman here, yeah.
Yeah, this question is addressed to all the three panelists, Professor Baird and Professor Dehejia, sorry, who both talked of translations in the sense of being potentially misleading in the field of research and the necessity to learn languages. I guess, I mean, if you move away from the Anglosphere a bit and go to Central Europe and look at the German and even the Soviet and later on the Russian practices in Indology and so-called Orientology, as they call it there, we see that it is absolutely impossible to contemplate doing fundamental research in any field of cultural studies, of ancient cultural studies, without knowing the language. Thanks.
I would agree with that.
Yes.
There was a much stronger tradition in those countries, but I mean, it is jeopardized in recent years horribly. And I don't think, I mean, my colleagues who are German academics are seriously lamenting the fact that Sanskrit and even classical Western languages are not being taught at their universities anymore. And major chairs have been lost and not filled. So I think the losses are, and in Russia too, the losses are quite significant.
Even in a major place like Berlin, I mean, it's under threat.
There's someone standing up with a mic there.
Yes. So this question is about the reoccurrence of certain incidents or people throughout history. So I wanted to know about, well, there's Noah and then there's King Utnapishtim from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and even the Hindu texts have such incidents that are recorded. So I wanted to know if there's any findings that would suggest, well, a collaboration of different cultures working on a text or something like way back then, or is it just silent plagiarism?
Ooh.
Plagiarism.
Plagiarism's a harsh word, I think, but inspiration and sharing.
And seeing one's own experience and one's own mythic characters in the light of other ones. So there's a kind of, none of these things are ever fixed, I think. They're massaged and reinterpreted, partly. I mean, you know, it's one of the big problems. How do you spot influence? And, you know, 19th century anthropologists used to think if there was the same phenomenon in two parts of the world, somehow that was because one must have influenced the other. We now see it's much more complicated, but how those similarities actually work and are generated, and how far, you know, also you have to add in our desire to perceive those similarities.
There's
it's very hard.
There's also shared Indo-European inheritance.
Well,
I mean,
exactly.
One theory for one explanation for why Poseidon carries a trident and Shiva carries a trident is that they're both descended from one.
Or even if not...
An economical explanation which is almost totally fantasy.
Well, no, you see, I mean, I think the mistake in that is that we try and imagine that there was one progenitor from which they have sprung. without actually seeing that actually Indo-European communities or others may have actually exchanged ideas to a far greater extent. There might not have been one model that is being aped. But you do have the Buddha walking on water and Jesus walking on water coming up as ideas at about the same time. You do have ideas about, the Noah myth, for instance, is a very good example. And there are many others like that. There are dozens of them, where there are many correspondences, and people, it used to be done. I mean, we've been brought up in an age when it's unfashionable to look at those correspondences. But I think we need to go back to those things, because it might be worthwhile to re-explore that kind of scholarship, might still be worthwhile. And maybe we discarded it too early, I think.
Could we get microphones to people with hands up?
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi.
Yes, Mr. Chakrabarti.
Right here. Yeah. So my question was that you guys spoke about how important it is that the understanding of classical tradition and the classical texts, right? But what about the narratives that don't reach us? Because, for example, in India, the oral tradition was very predominant initially, right? And so there's no physical evidence of a lot of things. And also, most of the times, sometimes, there are narratives that do reach us completely altered, because they tend to sort of favor the people in power, right? And so, for example, in India, this emphasis on Sanskrit, right, as the cultural tradition, classical tradition of India. What about the gazillion other narratives we're leaving out, So
we mustn't leave out. I mean,
no. I guess the IGNC, the Indira Gandhi Center, National Center for the Arts, does have a project. I mean, it started too late, perhaps, of recording oral history and oral traditions, and they're collecting folk and music. I mean, folk is a tricky word, so I'll put it in inverted commas. All of what you're saying is absolutely right. All of those need to be recorded, but they are collecting the manuscripts. It was only just that Sanskrit was mentioned, but the number of Oriya manuscripts or number of manuscripts in Telugu and Malayalam, they all need to be dealt with. And we have to start giving more importance to this entire issue. You're quite right.
Yes, another question here, yeah.
My question is to all of the panelists. How do you go about distinguishing mythology from actual verifiable fact? And if I could give you an example of that, if we take Homer's Iliad, what, if anything, in that is actually true? Thank you.
That's one of the big questions of any attempt to look at either early Greece, pre-6th century, or Rome, pre-4th century. And the truth is that myth and history at that point are an inextricable mess. Did Romulus exist? Well, was Rome ever founded? Well, actually, cities are never founded in the way that's retrospectively kind of implied. There's quite a lot of work done on trying to tie in the names that you find in the Iliad with proper names in early Hittite texts. And there are people who claim that you can make so close matches that the old-fashioned Schliemann idea that there was a Trojan War, and that these were at some level real people, is broadly speaking verifiable. My problem with that is that I don't know where it gets me. Because what I've been doing, for most of my life, and I can see that it's a very partial decision. For me, the Iliad and the Odyssey are literature which is how they have been incorporated with all kinds of different spins throughout the period I'm interested in. Now, it's true that more Greeks than 21st century classicists would have said that Achilles was a real person, but they were also a bit smarter than we give them credit for about knowing that myth is true at a different order.
Yes. And I think that's the exciting thing about studying myth again in today's climate, because I think the studies in modern literary criticism about opening up the way in which mythology has been thought about, and what we are doing with myth even in fiction now, and the way we use metaphor, mythic metaphor, I think is a very good way, an example to be able to look even at historical texts, to not say that not read them as complete fact, but not read them as complete fiction. I mean, it is both. I don't know if you have anything to...
No, that was nicely put.
There's a question here.
Excuse me, I have the mic here.
Oh, yes, please. If you have the mic.
Actually, this is taking off from where this gentleman's question was. It's one thing to say what Schliemann did and looking for the palace of Odysseus and all of that. The problem is that in India, when you actually have a very large number of people who take the mythic and literary works as historical works.
Right.
And it started off, this entire movement that Ram Janmabhoomi was right here and Sita Ki Rasoi was right here.
Yes.
What happens when in that very dangerous situation? How do you insist that the study of the classical language and literature and literary text is important? And I agree that it is indeed important.
In fact, the answer to that...
But distinguish that this can't be taken as actual history, which then will start off this thing of going back.
Okay.
Well, it's not for a nostalgia for going back, but you need to study it all the more for that reason. Because otherwise there's a misrepresentation of the classical. There's this sort of popular perception of things, and there aren't enough scholars to counter those claims. There aren't enough people to come up to court or report in the papers adequately about the fact that this is a misrepresentation. And till there are more and more people who are reading the material in the original and actually looking at the archaeological record at the same time, there won't be a dialogue.
And you're absolutely right that in some ways Schliemann and Troy is a very safe and in some ways insignificant and very undangerous example to take. But even within my field, you could move to the origins of Rome and you could find modern Italian archaeologists recreating and claiming to excavate the very hut in which Romulus lived. Now, at some level, one can be slightly Schliemann-y about that, but it doesn't take you very much to see the nationalist kind of next step in arguments like that. Yes. Schliemann, belongs to nobody. Romulus is still part of an Italian nationalism.
My question is in kind of the same bracket, that is the lack of physical presence of what we have read mattered in a decline or contributed to the decline of faith in our classical text? Just like the woman said that the classical text has now been upgraded to being a religion or a very revered editions. So has the lack of physical presence of those particular, whatever is being talked about, in a decline of what we believe in those classical texts?
The dangers of politics in India, which has entered this field in a major fashion. It's what do we do about it? It exists, and how does one set that right? And I think what Professor Ahuja said about the fact that there are people who are studying those classics and are showing you how the Ramayana was probably, Lanka was an island, perhaps far away, maybe as far as the Godavari River. And if you go back to those sort of studies, perhaps it helps to put this politicizing into some sort of more accurate context. So we still need to study it in order to sort of de-link it from political movements of today.
Let's do another exercise. Imagine the Jaipur Literary Festival 2,000 years from now. And all the writers that we've had here and all the people that have been here, and if you consider them, would you like them to be considered completely defunct and irrelevant? Perhaps, yes. Maybe it's a leading question, but maybe not. You know, maybe there's a lot that's being produced in our own society that is sufficiently self-critical, interrogating ourselves. We have so many different plural voices amongst ourselves as writers today. If you think about the archaeologist, the classical scholar from 2,000 years ahead, I mean, what tricks must he have up his sleeve to convince his audience to be able to read us? I think that's my only plea, really. I mean, how can we not engage with writers of the past?
I think the time is up.
Time has unfortunately run out. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you to you, the audience, as well.
Big round of applause for Mary, for Alex, for Naman, and for Vidya. With this, we come to the end of this day today. Tomorrow again, we'll meet you here in Google Mughal tent again. Goodbye. Goodbye for now.